Hello and welcome to today's edition of Extraordinary Outcomes. I'm Shubhanjan Sarkar, your host and founder of PitchLink, the buyer-seller engagement platform. In our show today, we speak with Philip Eitzen, founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. Our news roundup from the world of sales, SaaS, and startups in NS3. And finally, Brian Chesky, founder of Airbnb, on how to build something truly viral. Let's dive right in. First, the news in NS3.
In this bulletin, consent management market to be worth 765 million by 2025. SPACs may cast wider net as competition increases. New York sees startup funding spike in 2021. Airtable launches marketing solution. Research firm Markets and Markets valued the worldwide consent management market at $317 million in 2020 and expects it to reach $765 million by 2025, growing at a CAGR of 19.3%. Consent management software manages the collection, storage, and documentation of customer consent. The major factors driving the growth of the market include growing awareness of data compliance regulations, the need for data security, and an increased desire for customers to control their consent and preferences. In the past 15 plus months, more than 550 special purpose acquisition companies or SPACs have gone public. Of those, more than 400 are still actively seeking their target, according to SPAC Insider. While not all SPACs are looking solely at tech, the sector has proven popular. However, as competition heats up and the number of EV and green tech companies with public market credentials begin to dwindle, software, social media, quantum computing, fintech, and more could be eyed by SPACs as investors seek out new corners of tech. Recent funding data shows that New York companies have pulled in $7.6 billion in seed through late-stage venture funding. If investment continues at this pace, the city will be on track for a record-setting year. So far this year, at least 25 New York headquartered companies have raised rounds of $100 million and above. While the pandemic had a devastating impact on many small New York businesses, technology startups in a number of sectors, such as fintech, e-commerce, gaming, and telemedicine, saw sharp growth in demand. Cash flush venture funds have been pouring more money into local companies in these spaces. Airtable, providers of a platform for building workflows, today launched a marketing solution to help teams streamline content and campaign workflows. With this new application, teams can create a single source of truth for all their marketing work. Airtable is built on top of a relational database, so it can power hundreds or thousands of users at a time, updating data in real time. Marketers can combine similar data from multiple sources, including Salesforce and Jira Cloud, into one continuously updated view. Thank you for watching. All links are also available in the show notes. If you have news about sales, SaaS, or your startup, share it with us at ns3@pitch.link. See you next time.
Meet Philip Eitzen, the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. Art of Procurement provides procurement leaders with the insights, resources, and expertise they need to drive company growth. Prior to Art of Procurement, Philip led procurement transformation, category management, and sourcing programs for clients of Accenture. Previously, Philip was head of international procurement, sourcing, and third-party risk management at Ally Financial. Now, onto this exciting conversation with Philip Eidson. Philip, welcome to the show. I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm glad that we could connect given our time difference and all that. Welcome.
Not at all. I really appreciate you inviting me onto the show, Supanshan, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Tell us a bit about yourself and the work you are doing at Art of Procurement. I think you'll bring a very different view to what conversations I've been having so far.
Absolutely. So from a personal perspective, I'm a 20-year procurement professional. I've pretty much worked in everything that there is to do within the procurement value chain, I would say, both on the direct materials perspective and the indirect procurement. So whether that's being a buyer, whether it's being a team lead, whether it's in supply chain risk management, sourcing, category management, and all the way up to a head of procurement. So I've done that on the practitioner side, and then I moved over to the provider side and did a lot of consulting around the space of procurement outsourcing and procurement transformation. And so what I want to do with Art of Procurement is, as you're looking now at technology as well coming in and changing the face of what procurement is, again, if you resist that, it's going to be really hard for you to have a good career in procurement. So I wanted to open people's eyes. I wanted to inspire them to think about change and doing things differently and just rethink the value proposition that they could have for their business. So we do it through a podcast, we do it through a membership community, we do it through some consulting as well.
And tell me, how do you see the role of the buyer in the B2B side, in a B2B transaction, the role of the buyer? How has it changed actually in the last 20 years?
Yeah, I would say, my start, I was very fortunate that my start was in an automotive company who invested a lot in strategic procurements. That was Ford Motor Company at the time. So they were really advanced. And interestingly enough, 20 years later, I still see a lot of organizations that still aren't as advanced as what we were, all those years ago. But from a profession perspective, I'd say, 20 years ago when I got started, mostly procurement was about being transactional and being tactical. So what that meant is, looking at a deal and looking at it as a one very specific thing, not really taking into account the big picture. How do I negotiate the best deal? How do I make sure that what I need gets to where it needs to be? How do I make sure that the quality is good enough and appropriate enough? And then basically, how do I firefight for everybody when things go wrong? When you look at the leading organizations today, 20 years on, the role of the buyer is, very different. It's much more of a commercial role and a general business role, I would say, that's focused on relationships and kind of like looking at challenges, like business challenges and business problems and trying to architect solutions to those using a supply base, as opposed to here's a spec or here's a scope of work, go and buy it.
How do you see the sales role, so the role of the vendor? So obviously this whole value transaction has two parts to it. And what we just spoke about is the buyer side. How has the role of the salesperson changed, or how has the environment changed which actually impacts the salesperson?
It's interesting because I think from a sales perspective, I think buyers, and I use the buyer not in the procurement sense, but in, somebody within an organization who wants to buy something, are a lot more informed today. You look at the buyer journey today versus where it was 20 years ago. A buyer journey today is go out and research. You have a challenge, you go and look outside to see how you can solve that challenge. And then once you have a good idea of how you think you want to solve it, then you start to talk to people. Whereas 20 years ago, it was, here's a rep who is trying to arrange meetings, from cold calls with as many people as possible to sell a product. And the buyer wasn't really informed to know the whole scope of what the alternatives were. They just knew if they heard something from a salesperson, yeah, this sounds like something I wanted, or no, it's not. And so then they would throw that over to procurement, and it would be kind of procurement's job to tell them in context of whether what they were hearing from this one organization was, something really interesting or, one of many. As opposed to today, they already know what they want before they really even talk to sales. So I think that makes, from a sales perspective, it's a lot more of a consultative, educational process than it is selling a product and selling features and selling benefits.
According to you, in today's environment, at what stage can the salesperson expect to get injected into the flow? And not to forget, that they're not the only person who are getting in. So the buyer is not talking to them alone.
Right.
Most probably, they're talking to 5 of their competitors at the same time. So when does this happen?
I think it differs depending on who is leading that outreach. Is that the buyer in the sense of the line of business, the stakeholder, the user is doing it, or is it somebody within the procurement function who's been tasked with doing it? If it's somebody that is in it's the stakeholder, then they've probably done a bit of research. They like what they see on their website. Maybe they've been referred by somebody, a peer or a colleague, and they've entered into a contact form. And they may only be having conversations with that one buyer at the moment because they're just trying to educate themselves, and they have reason why they want to contact that one provider. If it's a procurement person is probably reaching out blind to 4, 5, 6 different people. Maybe they're doing one just to get some initial research, but they're going to expand that to multiple providers so they can get a bigger picture. So I'd say from a sales perspective, if you have a business user reaching out to you, there's probably much more chance that it's just you that they've reached out to, or maybe it's a very, very small handful of people they've reached out to. If it's a procurement person that's reached out to you, it's probably they've reached out to many different people at the same time.
I'd see multiple versions of the buyer's journey today. I mean, starting from 7 steps to 10 steps to 13 steps and all that.
Yeah.
And by and large, all of them say that the vendor comes into the picture pretty much post 60 to 70% of the stages, because you really are starting with, can we solve it ourselves, to is this going to cause change management, who is going to do it, all those decision making, getting all stakeholders on board, allocating budget. Potentially, if you are investing in, say, in ERP for the first time, you're possibly deciding this year that we are going to invest this $500,000 next year. So it's not even going to be immediate by any stretch, right? So
I would say though that if it's a stakeholder that's doing that, they're going to be reaching out a lot sooner in the process, because they don't know what they don't know. So they're kind of on an information hunting and gathering. Like they have no idea really what the cost would be. So it's probably pre-budget that they're reaching out to somebody. Whereas if it's somebody in procurement who's in control of the process, then they're more likely to follow a more defined process, And again, it depends on the maturity of the organization. If it's a relatively low maturity procurement group, they're probably reaching out just like the stakeholder is. If it's a higher maturity, there's going to be a lot more time spent on making sure we've got some kind of budgets, making sure that there's a need, like all the make-buy stuff that you talked about. Kind of the bigger category strategy perspective is done before you start doing your outreach, at least on a deal-by-deal basis. So it's probably it's a good tell as to what the maturity of the organization is that you're working with, is when they're reaching out to you.
How natural is it for an organization to first reach out to a external resource? For example, we have never bought ERP. We need to understand we are an automotive company. We are producing 100,000 cars in Africa or wherever, or in India for that matter. And we have to now do X. We first should reach out to somebody who knows this and has done this in the past before we do anything. How often does that happen?
In my experience, not that often. I think it's partly what goes into the decision-making process will be what is the importance of what we're trying to achieve, and how critical is that to the goals of the business. The higher the criticality, I think the more likely that's going to happen, because the more likely to invest in some outside help. And I think the other question is, how much do we perceive internally the gap is between what we know and what we think we should know? And if they think that the gap is relatively small, then more often than not, I'd say an organization is likely to kind of chance their arm, if you know what I mean. Like they'll just take what they've got and they'll think that's good enough. But if there's kind of the self-awareness that there's a big gap and we don't know, and we know that we don't know and we need that help, then again, more likely that they'll reach out. I think that they've got to know that before they even start a conversation, to look outside, they probably have a good idea of that an ROI, like a business case, exists for them to do so.
I hear this quite frequently, that there are informal channels where multiple CIOs are part of a something even as mundane as a WhatsApp group,
Hmm.
and they talk and validate and get references of vendors and solutions and softwares and so on
Yeah.
quite regularly, and those
Yeah.
are very vital inputs. I mean, people have changed decisions based on inputs in these
Hmm.
communities because
Yeah.
they really trust each other.
Yeah.
How big is this according to you?
I think it's big and it's growing. And I say that because most most things that an organization buys, they don't buy it every single day.
Right.
They'll be buying it once every 3 years or once every 5 years, or whatever the time frame is. And
Right.
so you look at the ROI on having your own internal expertise in that. Most companies, and again, there's always those that are outliers, the biggest companies in the world, they can afford to have somebody who's an expert in at everything that they buy. Most companies can't, so they'll just have generalists. Those journalists don't have access to all the market insights and data to actually help them make those decisions. And that data can be expensive. And so I think it's just a natural way that the community comes together, or a group of people come together to help each other when they don't have all the information. And that may not be tell me what your pricing is, because all that kind of stuff is covered under confidentiality agreements, but it will be, hey, we're thinking about doing this. We're thinking about bringing these providers to talk to us about it. Where does that stack up? What are some of the things we should be aware of? What are the pitfalls that you've come across? Those kind of things. What are some of the questions that we should be asking of a provider when we go down a bid process? I think that's always existed, but it's usually existed in the confines of, a conference, an in-person conference. Now technology just makes it so much easier for everybody. Like you say, whether it's a WhatsApp group, whether it's an online community, whether it's a group on LinkedIn, whatever it is, you can now get so many people from such diverse backgrounds all coming together really easily to exchange information. I think that's only going to get stronger.
There are these customer review sites, right? Like G2 or a Capterra
Yep.
or how do these fit in? What do you see there?
Yeah, I think that, and maybe somebody will listen to this and tell me that my opinion is wrong, which wouldn't be the first time. But my opinion of that is that it's very useful for an immature procurement organization, or where they don't have a lot of insights or information, or for smaller companies. Smaller companies who are going and buying these things for the first time. I think that those things are useful. I think it serves more as kind of a confirmation bias. So it's like we've made our decision. Now we're going to go to G2 and see what G2 says. And if it says great, then we can go and say, hey, I made my decision partly because it says it's great here and it's really well peer reviewed. And if it says not so good, then it will be, yeah, well, there's probably just lots of dissatisfied users for their own problems. It's not really the software. So for most of the organizations that are larger, I would say they use it. If it's a good review, they may cite it. But if there's a bad review, they probably just ignore it.
When you're looking at an organization, so there is this procurement person, and you have mentioned the buyer, the stakeholder,
Yeah.
so to say, and we all talk about the buying committee today, right? So there is the CFO is part of that, possibly the CIO is part of that, depending on what you're buying, or your head of plant or manufacturing is part of that. So if you're setting up a plant and so on, or all of them are, because there'll be technology involved in all of that. Is there a sort of equation as to who actually calls the shot, according to what you see?
I think the strategic importance of the purchase to the business is, that and spend are the two things that define kind of how broad a buying committee, a purchasing committee will be. If you think about you buying something that's relatively small, from a financial sense, then it's probably the line of business and maybe even procurement are involved in making those decisions. And then the bigger the spend, the more important it gets, the broader that you open that up. At the end of the day, from a procurement perspective, procurement doesn't spend any money. It's all somebody else's, some other budget holder's money. So the best procurement organizations who are really well trusted and respected can heavily influence a decision. The worst do nothing but sign the contract. So in the vast majority of cases, it's certainly the business owner. And then where that fits in terms of the chain of command is relative to what their approval authority is, or strategic importance. Like I said, procurement play a transactional in the worst case, and have a heavy influence in the best case.
20 years back, the CIO, I mean, this is prior to Y2K. That's when the CIO came into prominence all over the world. And the CIO became part of the CXO table, right? Before that, they were not, I mean, they were technology heads or something like that. This whole coinage of the C role came up when that sort of manifested itself, or the importance of that and so on. So there is a thought that now the time for the CPO to find the place in the head table, right?
Yeah.
How do you see that playing out today?
So it's one of those things that it's a little bit of a pet peeve that I have of when I hear procurement folks talking about this desire to have a seat at the table, because it's almost like that's the end goal. One of the things that we struggle with in procurement is, and we did a survey of this, we had an event back in October of last year, and we surveyed our community and asked them what their challenges were. The number one challenge that came up was the negative perception of procurement that they face every day. So it's like there's almost like this desire to be loved, and getting a seat at the table is the KPI, if you will, for whether a procurement organization is loved or respected. I think that procurement plays in a lot of companies an ever increasing role, an ever more important role, because more organizations are using suppliers for more and more things. As you think about that make versus buy, a lot more are buying than making. It's just the nature of kind of where organizations are going. But the role that procurement can play is very different from organization to organization based on the culture of the company, what they need from procurement, what the technical specificity is of what's being bought, which means you don't necessarily have to strive to have the seat at the table to have an impact. So I always encourage people to think about, how can you have an impact on the goals of the business, and where, don't worry about where you need to sit to make that happen. But generally, I see procurement being talked about as a closer partner. When you take a 35,000 foot level of where procurement as a profession is going, the challenge that procurement has is that it's kind of like this, like a business cycle. As you think about the business cycle, there's times in the business cycle when cost pressures are higher than there are other times in the business cycle. So procurement typically gets this seat at the table when cost pressures are high and they need somebody to come in and beat up the suppliers or get creative to reduce cost or whatever it is. And then when a business changes its cycle and goes into more of a growth mode, procurement gets put off back in the box, so to speak, waiting to be brought back out of the box again when there's cost pressure. So for procurement to truly kind of keep that relevance, they have to break away from being perceived as just a cost cutter.
The wisdom that I hear is that the original role of procurement was to actually beat down the price. So I'm a bit surprised to hear from you that it's still the case in many scenarios.
Yeah, I think that most procurement organizations, again, we kind of surveyed our community on procurement maturity. Most would say that they're in a spot where in some areas of spend, they're what they would consider to be more strategic, excuse me, but in a lot of areas of spend, they're still, it's still a more traditional approach. And one of the difficulties for procurement is that, like you said, this perception of procurement as being the cost cutter is something that we created for ourselves. So, when you look back 20 years and kind of the professionalization of the procurement function, if you will, in most companies, people are trying to fight for investment funds to invest in procurement. And so selling that investment internally on an ROI based on savings was an easy sell, because they'll just say, especially when nobody had really strategically looked at purchases before, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, if you just apply traditional procurement process to it. So they'll make the business case, if you invest $1 million in helping in a procurement team, I'll deliver you $5 million in savings. And so that became the only thing that people saw that procurement would do, because that's what we built our business case on. And so now we've professionalized, and we've got all this investment in procurement. It's hard now to take a step back and say, well, that you made the investment in procurement based on the cost savings that we could drive. Well, actually, these are all the other things that we can do. And actually, all these other things have a greater impact on the business. But, the CFO says, well, but you're just a cost cutter, because that's what you sold me the value proposition on. Or all these things are all nice. You say you can create all this value in other ways, but again, your ROI is based on cost savings. So, you've got to make your cost savings before you can really think about these other things. And then you end up having conflict between what you as a procurement organization's goals are and what your business stakeholders' goals are.
In many scenarios where, especially when you look at the tech industry, where the company buys tech and sells tech and there is nothing else that is being bought and sold, according to Gartner, a lot of these can be negotiated very, very well using AI. Maybe it's already happening in certain cases. Unless you have sort of lifted your game and have become specialized and are in a position to sort of add value at a level which is not cost cutting.
Yeah.
Do you see a lot of procurement jobs actually going away?
Yes, to answer your question. From me, the procurement team of the future is a lot smaller than the procurement team of today. That procurement team of the future is probably, if that is embraced, is probably a lot more impactful than the procurement team of today, because that procurement team of the future is a team of catalysts. They're making change happen. They're a team of architects. They're looking at what business problems and challenges are and figuring out how to use solutions in the supply base to overcome those, or even looking at opportunities. And they're kind of consultants. They're consultants internally on how you can best leverage different suppliers in different scenarios, and probably firefighting. That's very different from the traditional, I'm procurement and I'm here to negotiate. And I'm here to create leverage. I mean, I really do think that a lot of traditional procurement skills are going away. And if not going away, very much commoditized. So those things that would make a procurement professional the top of their profession in the past, those things are not going to be that important. And so we're moving away we'll see how long it takes from a time perspective, but we're absolutely moving away from what it means to be a procurement professional, what the job is, and therefore what all the skills that you need are.
You are talking to a lot of procurement professionals on your podcast and in your community. What are the top concerns that you see they're talking of?
I think the top thing that I still hear, it's kind of frustrating in a way, because it's the same things that we've been talking about for 20 years, that don't go away. Alignment. I don't have alignment with my business stakeholders. I'm not agile enough. I can't move fast enough to support my business in what my business needs. I don't have the technology that I really need to be able to scale good practice. And I don't have the data that will inform me to make good decisions. Those are probably the 4 key areas that and I get frustrated so I was just reading a survey that came out a couple of weeks ago as like a procurement benchmark health check survey for a podcast that I'm actually going to do in a couple of weeks here. And I think the number was something like only 9% of CPOs think they're truly aligned with their business. And that's staggering to me here in 2021, that that's still such a huge disconnect, because that's the heart of everything. We of course have to keep good tension with our stakeholders. We're not here just to say yes to everything that they want, but the fact that we're still struggling to truly understand what it is a stakeholder group or a business needs, and therefore change our value proposition so we're providing that level of service, is amazing to me that that's still where we are. But I mean, that's still where we are.
Let's talk about art of procurement. How large is
Mhm.
the community? How did you get started with it? And
Yeah.
how has it grown?
Yeah, so we have, by the way that we track, we believe our community is about 15,000 strong, and it's mostly those who are wanting to change procurement or change. Again, I kind of said at the beginning, change the impact of procurement because that's really what we talk about. So I started out procurement 5.5 years ago. I'd been, like I said at the beginning, I'd been a practitioner, I'd been a consultant, I'd done a few things. Um, I was in an organization that had got bought by a large consultancy firm, and I kind of stuck around for a couple of years after that. But I'd always had this desire to go and do something on my own. And honestly, like when I started, my intent was to start a consultancy practice around procurement outsourcing because that's where I'd had a lot of experience, most recent experience. And I started the podcast on a little bit of a whim. I thought, I know I'm a business owner. I need people to get to know me, like me, trust me. I don't necessarily like going and standing in front of stages. I don't particularly like going and saying hello to people that I don't know. A bit of an introvert from that perspective. So maybe a podcast will help break the ice with people when I first get to know them, not knowing if anybody would ever listen. And here we are 6 years later, and it's kind of it's really the heart of what we do now. So what we do now is, we've got the podcast, we have webinars, we write papers, we do all kinds of stuff from a content perspective because we want to inspire people to think differently about what they can. It's like imagine the art of the possible. It's kind of the content side. The community side that we have is more, okay, now you understand and you can see the art of the possible. Let's bring you together with a community of your peers to help you on that journey. And then the consulting side is you need some one-on-one help, then we're here to help you. So it's been it's a roller coaster. Like I think a lot of people starting off and setting up a small business, and you kind of you're on a constant discovery process to figure out what you're doing and where you're going and how to talk about what you do and all those good stuff. But yeah, we're 6 years in and things are going well so far.
So what actually, I mean, one or two instances perhaps
Yeah.
you can talk of where those specific inputs actually helped you push your idea forward?
I think that one of the moments that pushed me to do it, and I may have said this earlier, but I'm not sure if we talked about this off mic, was really seeing the negative impact that outsourcing had on folks. And I wanted to prepare them so that when technology came along, technological change came along, they were able to take advantage of that from a positive perspective rather than a negative one. With an organization, for example, there's an organization 18 months ago that I worked directly with, who procurement was basically hated. They were out of the door. Nobody trusted and respected them. And so, coming in and working with a new leader on what transformation can look like and how to take a new mindset and how to help the team with that new mindset and just fix small problems that had created big issues, it's relatively easy to turn things back around again. So 6 months later, they have an organization that's suddenly at the heart of everything that company is doing. It doesn't need to take, 3 years, 5 years. You can see some really instant results just by doing some basic things. So that's certainly where some of the, where you're proud of some of the things that you're helping organizations do.
That's a great note to end this chat. I just hope when sales folks see this, they can either rejoice thinking, okay, we are getting rid of these guys finally, or they can see a reflection of what's likely to happen to their own roles within their own organizations.
Yeah, and I would say for sales folks, the biggest thing to figure out is what's the level of maturity of the procurement folks that you're dealing with on the other side, because don't treat procurement as a one size fits all. We have such an adversarial relationship sometimes, and oftentimes that's deserved, because it's just procurement folks are doing things that aren't helping anybody. But most of the time, if you can figure out if you're working with an organization that's open and willing to work and that's a little bit more mature, a friend in procurement will help you go far.
Philip, thank you very much. I enjoyed this chat. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you inviting me on the show. Yep. Thank you very much.
Meet Fred Kopstek, a consultant, trainer, coach, and an expert helping sales professionals around the world to discover new and more powerful ways of how they can do business, build mutually beneficial relationships with their customers, and increase revenue.
I can see that sales is taking very much a move towards being more collaborative than ever. We can go through all the evolution of sales and the stuff that we saw in the 60s, psychological selling, if you like, and 80s, close, and of course the consultative stuff of the 90s. But now people are having to be more collaborative. This was pre-COVID. I would say that even more so now, salespeople are going to have to work tightly with customers, help them, guide them, be in the thing together. And I was very aware of this and lots of the brilliant sales models in the books that you talk about that are already out there. But I came across this concept of partnering skills, PQ. Now, everyone will probably have heard of IQ, and I'm sure many people will have heard of EQ, emotional intelligence. And I think of PQ, or partnering intelligence, as almost like the lesser known cousin in the family. And these are the skills that somebody who's good at partnering will have and are able to use, and often use quite consciously and quite deliberately. So I looked at this actually because I was doing quite a lot of work in channel management at the time. I was doing quite a lot with full-on indirect sales, partnering sales, if you like. But as I looked at these skills, I thought, this is relevant to any salesperson. It does not matter whether you're in direct or indirect. If you're doing any kind of, not purely transactional, but anything above that, these skills, if you can get your head around them and start to use them in the approach that's most suitable for you, they're going to make you better.
And finally, here is Brian Chesky, founder of Airbnb, speaking with Reid Hoffman in the very first episode of his show, Masters of Scale, on how to build something truly viral, something customers would love to talk about.
If you want to build something that's truly viral, you have to create a total mind experience that you tell everyone about. And so we basically took one part of our product and we extrapolated what would a 5-star experience be, and then we went crazy. So a 1, 2, or 3-star experience is you get to your Airbnb and no one's there. So you knock on the door, they don't open. That's a 1-star. Or maybe it's a 3-star if they don't open, you have to wait 20 minutes. And if they never show up and you're pissed and you need to get your money back, that's a 1-star. You're never using this again. So a 5-star experience is you knock on the door, they open the door, they let you in. Great. That's not a big deal. You're not going to tell every friend about it. You might say, I used Airbnb, it worked. So we thought, what would a 6-star experience be? A 6-star experience, you knock on the door, the host opens, hey, I'm Reid, welcome to my house. You're the host in this case. And you would show them around, and on the table would be a welcome gift. It would be a bottle of wine, maybe some candy. You'd open the fridge, there's water, you go to the bathroom, there's toiletries, and the whole thing is great. That's a 6-star experience. And you'd say, wow, I love this more than a hotel. I'm definitely going to use Airbnb again. It worked better than I expected. What's a 7-star experience? Knock on the door. Reid Hoffman opens. Get in. Welcome. Here's my full kitchen. I know you like surfing. There's a surfboard waiting for you. I've booked lessons for you. It's going to be an amazing experience. And by the way, here's my car. You can use my car. And, I also want to surprise you, but I got you, this is the best restaurant in the city of San Francisco. I got you a table there. And you're like, whoa, this is way beyond. So what would a 10-star check-in be? A 10-star check-in would be the Beatles check-in in 1964. I'd get off the plane and there'd be 5,000 high school kids cheering my name with cars welcoming me to the country. I'd get to the front yard of your house and there'd be a press conference for me. And I would be just a mind experience. So what would an 11-star experience be? I would show up to the airport and you'd be there with Elon Musk and you're saying you're going to space. The point of the process is that maybe 9, 10, 11 are not feasible, but if you go through the crazy exercise of keep going, there's some sweet spot between they showed up and they opened the door and I went to space. That's a sweet spot. And you have to almost design the extreme to come backwards. Suddenly doesn't just like having like knowing my preferences and having a surfboard in the house seem like not crazy and reasonable. It's actually kind of crazy logistically, but this is the kind of stuff that creates great experience.
Start with customer experience that becomes remarkable. That is the key. For every customer, if you can deliver a mind-blowing experience by design, then possibly that is all that you are likely to need. That's a wrap for today. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay well and convert more.